Just recently, my life has been turned upside down. I know that it didn't end there, that sooner or later it will come back. Maybe in a month, maybe in a year, 10 years, 100 years. It doesn't matter. But one day, events will repeat themselves, and I will have no way to stop it. Right now, I had to sacrifice everything. I had to make it go away. Calm down for a while. Fed up. But now I'm doomed to spend the rest of my days here. Soft white walls, a monotonous 2 by 2 meter room, a rusty bunk with a decrepit mattress. The fierce stares of the people who should be treating me, but instead, daily beatings, bullying, and a wild desire to tear me to shreds because of what I've done. If I were in their shoes, I probably would have behaved the same way. But no one knows what really happened. Nobody but me now. They don't realize that I had no other choice. By doing what I did, I saved a huge number of human lives from an agonizingly gruesome death, albeit at too great a cost. Today is my second week here. Usually my hands are tightly restrained with straps, but today is a special day. Accompanied by 2 burly men, a man with whom I had once shaken hands, spent evenings at the bar, and solved what seemed to be the most intricate and dark cases, entered my isolation cell. We used to be good friends, despite our status as superior and subordinate. He kept his eyes on me. There was not a drop of fear in his gaze, only sadness. Stepan Viktorovich was not a shallow man, on the contrary. His ingenuity and critical thinking and brought him to the rank of chief of investigation of especially serious crimes. Now he looked tired and devastated. It was not the first night he had spent snuggled up with a bottle of something strong. Despite the objections of the workers of the establishment, Stepan Viktorovich asked to leave us alone. One of his stern looks was enough to make even those healthy foreheads leave the room. He sat down on the stool given by the nurse. He hunched over, resting his forearms on his legs, and lowered his gaze. He clearly didn't know how to start a conversation. Taking a notebook and pen from his pocket, he held them out to me with the words, "I want you to describe to me everything from the beginning. All the events that have taken place since I received this damned case. You and I have a few hours, so you can take your time. I need to know everything, every detail, every little thing. I don't want to believe that for so many years I've been working side by side with a real beast in human form." I took the notebook and nodded silently. I didn't dare to write a word at first, but in the end I found a place to start. It was Monday. As usual, it was the hardest day of work. It was late fall, and it was already cool outside. Gray sky, long fallen leaves and puddles covered with a thin layer of ice. All this did not add mood to the already lazy state when you want to lie under a blanket with a head and sleep all day. Yes, this Monday turned out to be very hard indeed. Not so much physically, but mentally and morally. It all started with the fact that I and 2 of my partners, Alina and Seryoga, were called to the office of the bosses on a very important case. Entering the office, we sat down on the chairs and waited for clarification for what we were called here. Stepan Viktorovich was too gloomy and gloomy. He threw a folder on the table and, without saying a word, rubbed his eyes to relieve a little tension. "Do we need to familiarize ourselves with it?" I asked. "It's my fault for not giving you the file in the first place. I thought the second department could handle it. Newbies have to prove themselves somewhere. Open it and run your eyes over it," said the chief, still keeping his head down. I opened the folder and began to study the material. The thing was that for a couple of weeks now there had been some gruesome murders in the city. 3 bodies had been found, and already on the first one I was sharply nauseated, and from what I read became uncomfortable. As it turned out, a middle-aged man was found in his own apartment. Completely unclothed, he was literally nailed to the wall with huge nails on his arms and legs. One of the nails was also nailed to the wall through the victim's head. A huge piece of skin from his chest had been cut out and used to cover a small box on the table. It contained the man's genitals and the small blade that had apparently been used to operate on him. The number 1 was painted on his abdomen in black paint. The call to the emergency services came late at night. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, but the killer was not there. There is a possibility that it was he who dialed the number and then fled. Of the neighbors, only pensioners, no one saw or heard anything. During the search was found a lot of tapes with adult material, a whole closet of erotic toys, and a diary of the owner of the apartment. In it, he described how he watched strangers and even children, and later photographed and filmed them for his own personal purposes, which only he could understand. With the other two victims, things were no better. Another younger man with obvious signs of obesity was found in his own garage. The garage cooperative was not far from the forest belt, so there was no hope for any witnesses. The body was sprawled on the floor in a pool of his own blood. His huge abdomen was stuffed with garbage and neatly sewn up exactly in the middle. His insides were missing. In the man's stiffened hand was a can of soda, and his mouth had been torn open by placing a huge red apple in it. The number 2 was painted on the garage door, still in the same black paint. No evidence or clues were found. The third and final victim in this case was a young girl. She was found a couple of days ago in one of the garbage containers. The workers who came to pick up the garbage did not immediately realize what the matter was when under the stinking bags they saw such a picture. The body of a girl about 25 years old was at the very bottom of the tank, covered with dirty rags. Death had been caused by profuse loss of blood. The eyes had been gouged out with a sharp object, and in their place 2 huge coins had been stuffed into the empty eye sockets. The elbowed arms were in one of the garbage bags. They were strewn with gold rings with precious stones, various bracelets, and other accessories. Later, the identity of the deceased was established. The girl was engaged in the organization of betting, underground games, and had a record in the station for fraud. On the container where the body was found, as at previous crime scenes, there was a number. It's not hard to guess that it was the number 3. I handed the folder to my colleagues and sighed heavily. So we have some crazy psychopath who numbers his victims. I asked my boss. It's not that simple. You take the file and reread it a few more times. That way, a picture will emerge. Think about it. First of all, 2 of the 3 people killed were involved in violations of the law. The first one was some kind of crazy pervert. How many materials and things we seized from his apartment? The last girl was running some kind of bogus scheme that left people who fell for it broke. The only thing is, we got nothing on the other guy. No priors or violations on him. Secondly, why does this bastard draw numbers after every murder? Probably keeping some kind of tally. We'll have to find out. And third, have you noticed the frequency of the murders? It was exactly 3 days between the first and the second. Same as between the second and the third. You know what the problem is. It's the 3rd day since the last victim died, which means someone has to die again tonight. We've already got police beanbags all over the city. The public has been notified that a killer is on the loose. As of today, a curfew has been imposed. This has never happened before in these parts. It's a small town. Everybody knows everybody. And now this. Anyway, take the file and go over it again in detail. It's yours now. The 3 of you are going to work on it. Report to me every day. If you find anything out, call me anytime and report back. Roger that, I said to the chief and headed for my office. By the end of the working day, all the materials had been read dozens of times. I was racking my brain trying to figure out the connection between the 3 dead. Something told me that these weren't all just random murders. There had to be some kind of meaning here, considering that the maniac was counting his victims and wanted us to count with him. There was almost no one left in the station at that point. I didn't want to stay up late either, so I went home with everything I needed. It was hard to sleep that night. My head was full of thoughts and horrible pictures. Almost in the morning, I was able to forget myself with a shallow, intermittent sleep. When I woke up at 7:30 in the morning, I took a shower, drank a cup of coffee, and went to work. I couldn't wait to find out how the night had gone. and whether I'd gotten anything out of it. When I got to the department, the first thing I did was to go to my partners and ask if there had been any progress. "I think you'd better find out from Viktorovich," said Seryoga, pressing his lips together. I guess I should expect nothing good, I thought. Also, on the way to the office of the bosses, I met Alina. "What's going on there? Is it all bad?" I asked. "It couldn't be worse. Another murder. Before you go in, be aware that he's in a bad mood today. Because there's no progress on the case, he's being shaken from on high and demanding something be done immediately." "I just came from there," Alina said, patting me on the shoulder. There was nowhere to go. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Stepan Viktorovich stood motionless at the window, talking to someone on the phone. "I understand. We are doing everything possible. I've handed the case over to the specialists. In the next few days we will deal with it." He calmly finished the conversation and hung up. Then he turned to me. "You are already aware of it, right?" Stepan Viktorovich asked. "Well, I don't know the details, only that someone was killed again in the night," I answered. The chief exhaled, then continued. "At morning a body was found on the forest border. Her grandmother found her husband. Their house was nearby. The poor man's arms and legs were twisted backwards. An inverted cross had been hammered into his forehead, and he had been hanged from one of the trees. In his pocket they found a note. 'Sinful are those hands that do not work. Weak are those legs that do not walk.' The note has already been given for examination. According to the grandmother, the grandfather had not done anything for a couple of months. He drank and lay on the couch. He quit his job. She fought him as hard as she could, but the next evening he went out for a drink and didn't come back. In the morning she went to look for him, and there was a dead body. She felt sick, so they took her to the hospital. As you probably thought, the tree was marked with the number 4. Yeah, well, that's a bitch. This bastard is not only a sick psychopath, but also some kind of sectarian." I summarized and thought, why kill a man just because he does nothing? And the second victim, the lonely fat man who also did nothing wrong. My thoughts were confused, racing through my head at the speed of light. The first one's a pervert and a sex maniac. The second, a common fatty. Next, a con artist after money. And the last one is a deadbeat grandpa who's been sitting on the old lady's neck. 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's when it hit me. I almost fell off my chair. "Stepan Viktorovich, I solved the riddle," I shouted. The boss looked at me perplexed, already obviously disappointed in everything, and not hoping for anything good. "What is it?" "What?" "Look. This freak thinks he's God and punishes people for their sins. It's the most logical explanation for what's happening. The victim number symbolizes one of the 7 deadly sins. The first 4 victims are literally the embodiment of lust, gluttony, greed, and laziness." I blurted out. Stepan Viktorovich scratched his chin, thinking about my theory. He slowly sat down on the chair and stared at one point. After about 15 seconds, raising his eyes to me, he said, "You're just Sherlock. I gave you this case for a reason. And according to your theory, he's got at least 3 more murders in the pipeline. Anger, jealousy, and pride. Well, it's up to us to make sure it doesn't come to that. We have time to vet suspects and search for evidence. The next murder is still 3 days away." After talking to my superiors, I went to Alyona and Seryoga to give them instructions on how to proceed. "You, Alyona, go through the files of each murder again. Find out more information about the victims and try to trace a pattern in the crime scenes he chose. Maybe we can figure out where the next murder should take place. Well, you're working side by side with me now, Sergey. I need someone to cover my ass in case something happens. I'm done." In a couple of days of work, we were unfortunately no closer to identifying the bastard. The gaps between the murders were the hardest to find. The killer would just disappear during that time. Falling through the ground, then successfully attacking people days later. We all realized that if this continued, there was no escaping the media publicity, and it would get worse. On top of that, I was concerned about a number of questions that I just couldn't find answers to. How does he manage to remain undetected? Not a single clue or piece of evidence, except the ones he left behind on purpose, on top of such gruesome murders. It seemed as if the maniac was going to leave his mark on history, so that in the future he could be compared to the damned Chikatilo himself. It was clear that we had already found out the reason and criteria for killing the victims, but how could anyone know about it? Assuming that the con artist and the fat man were found by the killer without any problems, how to explain the rest of the murders? It turns out that someone must have known about the nefarious activities of the first victim. But how could anyone know what was going on in the lives of some pensioners? Did the maniac so carefully and for a long time observe people before choosing them as his victims? And the dead are absolutely unrelated. There are no relatives, friends, or even acquaintances among them. It was a real dead end. We spent several days in such a futile search, until the next, already the fifth murder. But this time it was different. We got a lot more information than we'd gotten before. And that's because there was an eyewitness who survived. And what he told us drove us deeper into the hole. The witness was a young guy. He was only 18 years old. He said, "My classmate and I went out for a walk that night. First we stayed at home, but then we decided we needed some air. We went to our park. It was dark, but the lanterns still illuminated the road. We didn't pay much attention to what was going on around us, talking about our own things. My friend had just had a fight with his girlfriend. He had always had a temper, as long as I could remember, but that night he was just tearing up. Very angry at her, covering her head to toe in swear words. That's pretty much what we talked about. We knew these places like the back of our hands. We walked like that until a comrade's hand pressed into my chest. He stopped me, pointing into the distance. There was someone standing there under the light of a dim lantern. Because of the distance and the darkness, the figure seemed completely black, and only the outline was visible. The stranger stood exactly in the middle of the road towards us. It was a bit strange, and even creepy. There was no movement on his part. He just stood there. He was wearing a long cloak that reached almost to the ground, and a large hat. To avoid any problems, we decided to turn around and head back towards the exit of the park. After walking 100 meters, ahead of us we saw the same silhouette, which stood still and sort of looked in our direction. Somehow, instinctively, I even turned around, confused. Before I could fully realize the situation, Igor, the very same friend, shoved his hands into his pocket and strode towards the stranger. I knew what was about to happen, given his nervousness and recent events. There would be a fight, and this man would take it. I moved there, too, to stop Yegor. He was mumbling to himself. "What's up, asshole? Don't you have anything to do? You're joking. I'll be right with you, and we'll laugh together." But when he got close to me, he stopped, and then he began to take slow steps backward. I, not really aware of my actions, stood like a stumbling block about 10 meters away from my friend. The silhouette suddenly moved from the place and began to approach. Then, sharply appearing near Igor, he caught him in the neck and lifted him a little above the ground. That's when my knees shook. What kind of strength it takes to lift a man so easily with one hand. Despite this, I snapped out of it and ran to my buddy's aid. But as soon as I got closer, the thing that was standing there threw Igor aside as if it were a rag doll. I was numb with horror, and all my courage evaporated in a flash. And then I fell into the iron grip of this creature. Yes, the creature. It was hard to call it a man. His hat covered half his face, leaving open only his mouth, which was open in a ghastly smile. I could barely breathe, and then he lifted his head, staring straight into my soul. His eyes were as black as the night sky. Absolutely black, no irises or pupils. His lips were exactly the same color. His skin was white, as if rubbed with chalk, A long, sharp nose and equally sharp, dirty teeth. It was like he was trying to see something in me, staring into my eyes. After a while, the monster lost interest in me. I fell to the ground and tried to regain my breath, at the same time coughing heavily. When I came to my senses and could stand on my feet, there was neither him nor the body of my friend. I got up and ran away from there. And when I got to the highway, I immediately called the police. There was silence in the office. I wanted to smoke, even though I had quit a couple of years ago. It was decided to let the teenager go, taking his contact information and asking him not to leave town for a while. We wrote off the ravings about the creature's ghastly appearance to a wild imagination and the degree of alcohol in the victims' heads. But everyone who was well acquainted with the case, somewhere in the depths of his soul, doubted this theory. This was evident from the tense and sometimes frightened faces of the staff. Alina was harnessed with all sorts of paperwork and reporting, while I and Seryoga had to take a few more people from the department and go in search of the body of the missing guy. Looking ahead, I will say that surprisingly, the body was not found neither this day, nor even the next day. Well, for the entire next week, there were no murders in the city. Our heads were ready to pop like popcorn. We just had to throw up our hands in front of our bosses. No one knew what had happened or what would happen next. Maybe the maniac had had enough and just laid low. Or maybe he is preparing something truly monstrous, which will make all the previous nightmares seem like flowers. Nevertheless, there was a little hope that it was over. Not so much hope as just a desire to forget everything that had happened like a terrible dream and move on with my life. During the time I had been working on this case, my physical and mental state had deteriorated several times. My health was affected by sleepless nights, lack of proper nutrition, nervousness, and obsession with what was happening. It was as if the killer had taken up residence in my head. I couldn't stop myself from thinking about him. His image haunted me in my nightmares, which made it hard to get even a couple hours of sleep a night. At first I was driven by pure excitement and the desire to punish this freak for everything he had done. But after that, it turned into psychosis and insanity. I was in a constant search for information, connections, and leads. I was looked at askew at work, repeatedly inquired about my condition, but I lied that everything was fine. The lull lasted until one day at work, I found a package in my office. A small box stood on my desk. There was no doubt that it belonged to me. The recipient line listed me, my last name, and first name. The tension increased when I noticed a few small red blobs on the back of it. It was scary to open it, but at the same time I was curious. Determined, I opened the package. The contents made my eyes darken, and I almost fainted. Leaving a few purple spots on the inside of the box, 3 severed human fingers lay side by side. From the first glance at them, I realized that these fingers belonged to different people. One was clearly female, and the other 2 were male. But that's not all I was able to find out. On each of them were neatly carved numbers, 5, 6, and 7 in order. The puzzle is complete. These are the last 3 victims. That's 7 people now. Exactly the same number of deadly sins as there are in religious doctrine. Yeah, that's right. But why did I get this package? He's playing me. He knows I'm obsessed. Why are the last 3 murders only being reported now? Maybe we just haven't found the bodies, or maybe he did it on purpose so he could execute his evil plan before it was discovered. I'd come too close to figuring it out, but I didn't realize it until it was too late. I dropped my head onto my hands, leaning back against the table. A grin involuntarily appeared on my face. He'd outplayed me. It had all been a devil's game. A game in which I'd been defeated. Gad turned out to be more cunning. With these thoughts, I quickly packed my things, hiding the box in the closet, and left the station, informing my superiors that I felt extremely bad. The reason for this haste was the piece of paper that also lay in the box. Soon, that's what it said. I didn't tell anyone about the find, because it would have been extremely difficult for me to explain how the package had ended up in the office, the keys to which only I had the keys. I couldn't even share it with Serioga. In the end, I made an unexpected decision. To go to a local grandmother, who was either a fortune teller or a witch. One day, this grandmother was on our case. Neighbors called the police, saying that the old woman had gone mad and was behaving inappropriately. We came to the place, questioned the neighbors, then the grandmother herself, but found nothing illegal in her actions, so we left with nothing. Now I was rushing to the same address, hoping that she was all right and could help me. I had never believed in anything like that, and even despised people who think we are surrounded by mystics and psychics. But now everything had changed. After everything that had happened, I was ready to believe in anything. When I arrived, I immediately found the right house. Not much had changed here. Knocking, I listened to see if anyone was in the house. After about 2 minutes, there were quiet, slow footsteps coming toward me from the back of the house. The door swung open, and on the threshold I saw the same old woman. Strangely enough, I remembered her appearance clearly, as if I had seen her many times. She looked the same as the last time I'd seen her, even though it had been years since I'd seen her. A witch, I thought. The old woman recognized me, a haughty grin on her face. "You've come at last," she said. "How? You waited for me?" I was surprised. "Yes, I sensed your imminent visit. I even know why you're here. But it's too late. The ritual is already done." I was stunned by what I heard. I wonder if she's not just a crazy old woman. That's what I came here for, though, so I can't be surprised. What's the ritual? Can you help me and tell me what's going to happen? And it should happen, as I understand with me. I blurted out, "Not only with you, to that already this night will be released from the underworld itself. It does not matter who to kill. The main thing is to take as many sinful souls as possible. And as you know, sweetheart, we're all sinners." I don't understand. How is that even possible? Who was that creep we were chasing with the whole department? Was it his fault? I couldn't get enough of him. I'll tell you the basics, because there's no point in going into it. I've been doing it all for a long time. It's passed down through the female line, from my grandmother to my mom, and from my mom to me. Now listen. At that moment, the old woman swallowed and began her story. The one you've been hunting so hard for is nothing but a real degenerate, a servant of the devil himself. His job is to open the gates and let the one who cannot be spoken of into our world. From the start, you have no chance of catching him. He cannot be tricked or tracked. When the ritual is complete, he goes back to the realm of the dead, leaving no trace. But then, something more sinister and brutal remains on Earth. The most real demon, which every 100 years takes an incredible number of human souls. There are 2 ways to get rid of it. Either wait for the creature to satiate itself and crawl back to itself, or make a sacrifice. It will only leave for a while if it is satisfied with the sacrifice made. It takes a trio of women's sinful souls to make it good. It so happens that women are by nature weaker, hence their torments and agonies are much sweeter for such entities. The hearts of the unfortunate must be donated in a special way. Otherwise, the person performing the ritual runs the risk of angering the demon, who will take his soul and a couple hundred others. Then the old woman told me about all the details of the ritual, and then continued. At one time, from this thing bought off hundreds of human souls, and at other times, young girls were not spared. Gather from the whole village 3 of the most promiscuous, and sacrificed against their will. At first, the demon can only take those who believe in him. If you tell someone about it, and they believe it, that's it. You delay your death for a day by passing the curse on to the one you told. But after a while, the creature fattens up and regains its strength. Then you don't have to believe in it. You just hear about it or read about it, and it's gone. You can sleep well tonight. He'll come to me. I believe in him. I know it's true. But he will not get anything this night. I know how to drive him away from me. I will hold a ritual that will give me protection for this night. And you come back tomorrow. I'll tell you what to do to win a few nights. But be warned, it won't help for long. He will get angrier and hungrier as time goes on, and then it won't save him. The old woman is done. And I, without saying a word, went outside, where I smoked and tried to come to my senses. Everything seemed unreal, not real. As if I was just in a nightmare and I should wake up and everything would be over. Despite the wild fear of impending horror, I decided to do as the old woman told me and went home. As I got up in the morning from the rays of sunlight streaming through my window, I realized that I was indeed alive. Nothing had happened to me, so the hag wasn't lying. I took a couple weeks sick leave at work. After having breakfast and finally taking a hot shower after so many days, I decided to go to the village again. Upon arrival, I encountered a couple of dumbfounded and wild looks from the residents. Parents were driving their children home. Old people were in a state of despair and were whispering among themselves. An inexplicable feeling of uneasiness came over me. When I finally reached the witch's house, I knocked, but there was no response. After a few tries, I kicked at the door, and it swung open, releasing a foul odor of herbs and iron into my face. When I got into the room, I fell on my ass and huddled in the corner with my knees drawn up. The whole room was covered in blood and human scraps. There were some bowls, tinctures, herbs, and other nonsense scattered everywhere. I guessed what had happened. The old woman was looking for something, but apparently couldn't find it. All the things in the house were torn up and scattered. Apparently, not finding something important, the old woman met her death. Couldn't defend herself against that thing. As I crawled out of the house, I noticed another grandmother on the neighboring property. She was peering carefully out of the door. I reached her house on woozy legs to ask her what had happened, though I knew the answer. The old woman's neighbor explained. It got to her. Something terrible came that night. I woke up to Valia's terrible screams and animal growls. There was a rumble throughout the village. The men looked out of the window in the morning and turned white as chalk. They got in the car and went to the city for help. There was no communication. The whole village knows what happened there. We all believe in this devilish thing. Fucking hell. I said doomedly. It's a horrible death for all these people. There are women and children. No, I won't let that happen. 3 innocent souls. That's the price. By any standard, it's better than 100 children and old people. That's what it seemed to me at the time. I can't and don't want to go into detail about what I did. After riding around the lowest grade clubs in our small town, I first lured, and afterward disposed of a trio of frivolous individuals. Regardless, I felt madly sorry for them, but there was too much at stake. Before midnight, they were out of breath. I tried to make it as quick and painless as possible. In the end, having done everything as it was told, I just fell on my knees and closed my eyes. At that moment, it was as if my soul had left my body. I was near those corpses, but at the same time, my consciousness was not with me. I didn't hear or see anything. I felt nothing. I woke up behind bars. It was daytime. I don't know how long I spent in that state, but all that awaited me was endless interrogations. All the murders that had taken place up to that point, of course, were blamed on me. Then the trials and investigations. After a while, I was deemed insane and put away where I am now sitting with my former boss. I finished the story and handed it to Stepan Viktorovich. He read it all for a long time, returning to what he had already read several times and looking at every word. When he finished, he simply put the notebook in his pocket and walked out without saying a word. Obviously, he didn't believe me. Now he, too, thought I was a sick psycho who was out of his mind trying to catch a killer. To be honest, I realized that I had done a monstrous thing myself, and it was just as hard for me. But now, that village can live in peace without fear for their lives. At least until it comes again.